Kia ora. Welcome to 2022. I'm Bruce Munro, and we're fortunate to have again with us for a new year International Relations Specialist, Professor Robert Patman. And this, of course, is Global Insight. Welcome, Robert.
Morning, Bruce.
Let's start Global Insight for a new year by asking, what do you think are the top 3 foreign affairs issues that we'll need to keep our eyes on this year?
That's a difficult question, and I did think about this carefully, but I think basically the top 3 in my view are as follows. Firstly, I think a continuing response to COVID-19 and recovery from the pandemic. The second one I would say is continued progress towards combating climate change, which threatens life on the planet. And thirdly, what I call dealing with dissatisfied power. So perhaps we should start with the COVID-19 issue. We're now entering the 3rd year, Bruce, of the pandemic. And there's some sobering realities. We have not seen a global solidarity response led by science. Unfortunately, we've seen a piecemeal response to this problem. And to give you an illustration of this, in December 2021, 66% of the population in high-income countries had already had their first vaccination shot. But in low-income countries, the figure was as little as 9%. So one of the big challenges facing us in 2022 is to meet the UN target of having the whole world's population, 70% of it, vaccinated, at least have their first shot. And that seems incredibly ambitious, you know. So we really need to reduce vaccine inequality. And at the moment, we're trying to deal with a global problem through a sort of state-centric mechanism, countries doing their own thing. And it's not really working. And we will be, if we don't become more ambitious in how we treat this problem, if we don't develop a public health global infrastructure, if we don't do that, then we're going to be condemned to have more and more mutations like Omicron, Delta. And there could be, you know, healthcare specialists are telling us these are just the tip of the iceberg, what could happen unless we have a much more comprehensive approach. The second issue, climate change. I think there was a fair degree of optimism, measured optimism is probably the way of putting it, after the meeting in Glasgow at the tail end of last year, COP26, to deal with climate change. There was some encouraging progress. Countries which had reasonably been aloof from measures to combat climate change have now joined in. Countries like Russia and India have set targets. Perhaps they are rather cautious targets, but they're welcome. And countries like the United States and China have put aside their geopolitical differeses to cooperate on combating this global threat. So I think there's some encouraging trends there. In 2022, of course, we need to keep our eye on curbing emissions and making sure that we are actually making progress towards that target set in Paris back in 2016 of keeping emissions down to about 1.5%. So it's very, you know, it's a real struggle. The third big issue is how do we deal with dissatisfied powers? You and I have spoken a lot in 2021 about China, but another dissatisfied power is Russia. And Russia, since 2014, has been engaged in a conflict with Crimea, with Ukraine. It annexed Crimea in 2014, and also more than 1,000 Russian troops got involved in the eastern part of the Ukraine. As we speak, more than 100,000 troops now surround the Ukraine, which has led speculation that an invasion is imminent.
Focusing on that issue for a moment, Ukraine and Russia. Why does Russia want Ukraine?
Well, officially, the explanation given by Mr. Putin, and we need to look at his demands. What does he want? Officially, NATO aggression, as he calls it, has called Russia to become increasingly concerned that the Ukraine may become a member of NATO. But there is a fair degree of scepticism about that explanation, simply because NATO was never on the agenda for Ukraine before 2014. Not as far as Ukraine itself was concerned. And Russia's actions have actually had the opposite unintended effect of making the part of Ukraine which is not occupied by Russia look towards the Western world for protection. And we've seen that trend accelerate with Russian troops around. Now, what does Mr. Putin want? He wants two things. He wants, first of all, a legal guarantee from the United States and the West generally that the Ukraine won't be allowed ever to join NATO. The second demand he's made is that those countries, those Eastern and Central European countries which joined NATO in the post-Cold War era, and we're talking about 14 countries, that the military infrastructure that they now have as a result of being members of NATO must be disestablished. So, in a sense, this has led to speculation that Mr. Putin's interest in Ukraine goes beyond Ukraine. It actually wants, if you like, the recreation of a Russian sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, something which the Russians vehemently deny. But the nature of those demands, and Mr. Putin has put himself in a difficult position because he said categorically, if the Americans do not agree to these demands, then Russia will resort to what he calls military technical measures to resolve the problem. So we are in a very dangerous situation at the moment.
It's been said that Russia can be either an empire or a democracy, but it can't be both. If that's true, it suggests that Putin does want to invade Ukraine. How likely is war?
Very difficult to predict precisely. I said there was scepticism about Mr. Putin's explanation about NATO causing the problem. Why was there scepticism? Because most of the countries concerned, it's not Washington that's pushed for NATO expansion. It's the countries concerned. Countries like Poland and Bulgaria and Romania pushed and made it quite clear that they must become members of NATO. Why did they do that? Because they have historic memories of Soviet interference in Eastern Europe in the Cold War period between 1947 and 1989. So many of those countries are fearful that a strong leader like Putin will seek to create a sphere of influence, and one way they can guard against that is being part of a multinational military alliance. Skepticism about Putin's explanation leads to the deeper question, why is this issue rising now? I think there are domestic political reasons for this. Mr. Putin's facing a lot of heat at home. The economy remains sluggish. Remember, we're talking about Russia, which presents itself as a great power, has an economy smaller than Italy or Spain. In addition, there are signs that younger people in Russia are not relying on the state media. They're relying on the internet for their news and are showing what Mr. Putin would see as quite independent views. And Mr. Putin has been in power for 22 years as either president or prime minister, and he is quite ruthless in dealing with opposition. For example, his major political rival, Alexei Navalny, was both poisoned and then imprisoned when he returned after treatment for being poisoned in Germany. When he returned to Russia, he was imprisoned. So some people are interpreting Mr. Putin's push in the Ukraine as a way of deflecting from problems at home and ensuring the survival of his regime by playing the nationalist card and showing that under his leadership Russia is becoming a great power on the world stage. And as we've seen in the past, authoritarian leaders often resort to foreign militancy when things are not going well at home. And we can't rule out that possibility.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. Catch us next time on Global Insight. Te pono me te araha.